Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the Hanoverian Dynasty in part 2, beginning with the reign of the luxurious yet troubled George IV, moving through the Reformist years of William IV, and gently arriving at the majestic era of Queen Victoria, the woman who defined an age. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of royal footsteps and sweeping reforms to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, be sure to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to join our cozy circle of history lovers. We're always happy to have you here. George, later crowned King George IV, came into the world on August 12, 1762, at St. James's Palace in the heart of London. Born as the eldest son of King George III, he was loaded with titles like Duke of Cornwall, Rothesay, and Earl of Carrick right from the start, and just 5 days later, he was named Prince of Wales. His wild lifestyle and rebellious streak would shape a colourful life, as we'll dive into below. He was named after his father, King George III, monarch of Britain and Ireland, and Prince-Elector of Hanover in northern Germany. George III had taken the throne less than 2 years before Prince George's birth. He was the king's eldest child. George's mother was Queen Charlotte from the House of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a mid-sized German state in the 18th century. She was only 17 when she wed George III in September 1761. There was little age gap between them, the king being in his early 20s, and their marriage was remarkably happy for royalty. Prince George was the first of their 15 children. They were fortunate by 18th century standards, as 13 of these children reached adulthood, and most lived long lives. George entered the world at a pivotal moment in British history. On one hand, the nation was on the cusp of massive colonial expansion and social and economic growth, propelling this small island on Europe's edge to become the world's mightiest power in the 19th century. A few years before George's birth, Robert Clive and the English East India Company began conquering swathes of India, a process that would continue for decades until the subcontinent was fully under British control. India was just one arena of British growth. A year after George's birth, Canada was gained from France in the 7 Years' War's peace terms, and soon James Cook would explore the South Seas as the Royal Navy planted new outposts worldwide nearly annually. At home, innovations in the textiles industry during the 1760s signaled the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Yet, the nation faced challenges. The oldest colonies in North America grew increasingly frustrated with crown rule and heavy taxes, soon sparking rebellion. While at home, social issues persisted, including public hostility toward Roman Catholicism. Growing urban poverty would soon add to the mix. These formed the backdrop to George's life and eventual reign. Royal children in England were typically raised in separate households with dedicated staff. Prince George was no exception. His governess was Lady Charlotte Finch, daughter of the Earl of Pomfret, supported by a wet nurse and other staff, including cradle rockers during his infancy. At age 4, George was vaccinated against smallpox with one of the experimental vaccines tested across European courts in the late 18th century. By 5, he could write, and his education progressed under learned tutors like Richard Hurd, Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry. Royal education was odd. George was pampered in most ways, yet his father believed in corporal punishment for learning, so George faced physical discipline when his studies faltered. As he grew, he showed intelligence, with a knack for Greek and Roman classics and an interest in new sciences. But he had a defiant streak. George soon proved a less than ideal heir. Though somewhat bright and aware of his duties as Prince of Wales, he admitted to being rather too fond of wine and women. By his teens, he was carousing in London, engaging in affairs with married royal staff, causing public scandals and headaches for the royal household. In late 1779, at barely 17, he began a relationship with Mary Perdita, a well-known London actress about 5 years older. Realizing a royal lover's life was more lucrative than the stage, Perdita quit acting when George promised her $20,000 upon reaching adulthood. When the relationship fizzled, others stepped in, and she was paid off with $5,000 and a $500 annual pension for years. This was just one instance of George's headstrong, carousing youth, traits that defined much of his life. George's drinking and affairs drew his father's ire. George III was unimpressed by his son's behavior, criticizing his academic shortcomings and attitude toward religion. The king also disapproved of George's companions, from rakes who fueled his drinking and gambling at London's tables, ruinous for many noble estates in the 18th century, to his friendships with Whig politicians like Charles James Fox, whose radical views made him unwelcome at the Tory-leaning court. Yet, George wasn't without talent. When sober, he displayed a sharp intellect, but his father's criticism seemed to push him further into indulgence, as if he relished rebellion. This was typical in youth, but persisted into his 20s and 30s, straining his relationship with his father, a constant and unhealed rift. This tension was partly fueled by the political crises of the late 1770s and early 1780s. In 1775, unrest in the 13 colonies over excessive taxation and lack of representation erupted into rebellion. In 1776, the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia declared the United States of America independent. The war was close fought in 1776-1778, but the Continental Army, led by George Washington, gained the upper hand. Britain's eventual loss was seen by George III as a personal betrayal by his American subjects. It also caused domestic political issues due to the king's support for Lord North, Prime Minister from 1770 to 1782, who was blamed for both starting and losing the war. Prince George's strained relationship with his father must be viewed against this backdrop. In the 1780s, the prince sought a larger public role, but his personal issues blocked this. Two major problems ensured his father wouldn't grant him one while he continued his reckless path. First was his debt. In 1783, at 21, George received a $50,000 annual parliamentary allowance, reduced from a proposed $100,000 by his father, who rightly feared he'd squander it. With $12,000 from the Duchy of Cornwall, his income was $62,000 yearly. Yet he spent it all and amassed huge debts. He splurged on decorating a Pall Mall house, sending agents to Qing China for costly vases, and maintained stables costing $30,000 annually, half his income. His drinking, gambling, and lavish spending on companions led to a staggering debt of over $250,000 by the late 1780s. In his mid-20s, setting a lifelong pattern of managing debt rather than living within his means. Worse still, in spring 1784, George met Maria Fitzherbert from Shropshire, twice widowed by 22. Instantly smitten, he secretly married her on December 15, 1785, in her London home. This was a misstep. As heir, George couldn't freely choose his bride. Royal marriages were state matters. English law required the monarch's approval for a royal child's marriage, rendering the union legally invalid and symbolic. When news leaked, it angered his father and stirred public backlash, as Fitzherbert was Catholic, a contentious issue in Protestant Britain. The marriage also raised legal concerns, as Catholics were barred from the succession, potentially jeopardizing George's claim if his children were raised Catholic. His reckless love life alarmed those in Westminster, especially as King George III showed signs of ill health. Since the 1760s, the king had displayed peculiar behavior, becoming agitated over trivial matters. By the 1780s, these episodes of the madness of King George, likely porphyria, a disease causing mental issues via toxin buildup, grew frequent and severe. In 1788, during one episode, the king physically assaulted George, unaware of his actions. These continued, with the king swearing, attacking staff, and acting erratically, leaving him incapacitated in 1788-1789. As the heir, Prince George became the focus of attention. When the first Regency crisis of George III's reign began in 1788, those in charge of the government, notably William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister across most of the 1780s and 1790s, had no idea how long the king might be incapacitated for. Indeed, his condition seemed to worsen in the late autumn, and it continued through the winter, faced with a crisis of a kind which had not been seen in England since the days of King Henry VI's bouts of catatonia in the mid-15th century. Pitt began consulting with other ministers and Prince George about a way out of the crisis. Together, they began formulating legislation for a Regency bill. Through this, it would be declared that the prince would act as regent for his father during his incapacity. The bill would effectively allow Prince George to take on all the powers and responsibilities of the king for as long as his father was indisposed, whether that would be days, weeks, months, or years. George III would remain as king, but his son, as regent, would be the de facto monarch in all but name. Luckily, before the legislation was ever finalised, and before George could assume the position of regent on an official level, George III recovered in the course of February 1789. It was far from the last such crisis of George's father's long reign, and the son would soon be called upon again to act as regent. The Regency crisis of the late 1780s was particularly worrying for British political leaders like William Pitt in more ways than one. Britain did not need a domestic crisis brewing when there were clear indications of trouble ahead on the continent. France was Britain's perennial enemy, one with which it had been in conflict regularly since the 12th century. Consequently, many people in London and England might have looked on with glee in the 1780s as France became mired in an ever-deepening economic and social crisis. However, they would have been less amused when King Louis XVI's efforts to stem the crisis saw a revolution break out in Paris and Versailles in the summer of 1789. The people of England, along with pretty much everyone else in Europe, watched with horror in the months and years that followed as the French Revolution became ever more radical. By the middle of 1792, the situation was so extreme that Austria and Prussia went to war with what soon became the French Republic. Britain followed them to war early in 1793. The French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars that followed would last down to 1815. Britain would be at war with France for approximately 20 out, or of those 22 years. This would form the backdrop to George's growing efforts to play a greater role in British political life in the 1790s and 1800s, and his regency in the 1810s. The early 1790s saw a continuing standoff between George and his father after the king recovered his health. Some of this focused on the prince's debts, a huge proportion of which were being created as a result of his lavish development of Carlton House as his London residence. This would become a cultivated and artistic statement of Hanoverian culture when it was finished, replete with paintings by some of the great masters of the 17th and 18th centuries. Chinese vases, French furniture, and many other high-end items from Europe and Asia, all tastefully assembled and completed by designers that George paid great sums to bring over to England from the continent, but it cost a fortune. Then, to compound the insult to the treasury, George eloped from London once it was nearing completion to go and live in Brighton on the south coast with Fitzherbert, a move which seemed more designed to spite his parents than anything else, though he was surely getting too old for adolescent petulance. In London, the king worried when news was received that the prince was negotiating a loan from the French government to try and maintain his lifestyle. The public perception of George around this time was at the worst level imaginable. The Times newspaper described him as a hard-drinking, sexually loose individual, removed from religious and decent society and constantly surrounded by swearing gamblers, finishing with the apt line that he would, quote, at all times prefer a girl and a bottle to politics and a sermon. This was the low ebb of George's existence. It seems to have been the case that the Regency crisis of late 1788 and early 1789 had imbued in him the possibility of finally being given some important role in public life, and that once the opportunity dissipated upon his father's recovery, he doubled down on his rather debauched existence. The public at large were not happy. On one occasion around this time, he was on his way to a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral in London when crowds along the streets of the capital began jeering at his coach. Things were not any better at court, and what especially irked George's father was that the standoff between himself and his son was now seeping into Parliament, where the Tories were standing firm behind the monarch while the Whigs were presenting themselves as supporters of the prince. This was nothing more than pure opportunism. It was not as though George had much to offer the Whigs policy-wise. The only goal was to curry favour with him in the expectation of a fresh Regency crisis down the line if the king's health continued to decline. When it became apparent in the course of the early 1790s that the king would not be falling back into a state of mania, and George's finances continued to cause him ever-growing problems, the prince began to develop a more conciliatory approach. First, he distanced himself from his pseudo-wife, Maria Fitzherbert, and eventually, on the 23rd of June 1794, she was informed that her relationship with George was over. He didn't do this in person, instead writing to her to this effect. He had little choice other than to take this course of action. His debts were now a crippling $600,000 or so, a sum equivalent to about $65 million in today's money, and they could not be resolved without a rapprochement of some kind with his father and mother. Hence, George indicated to them that he would now seek to marry and produce a royal heir in line with his duties. This certainly does not mean, though, that he stopped philandering in general. George would have many further mistresses throughout his life, many of whom were already married, and he clearly desired several illegitimate children, though not as many as have been claimed. One recent survey noted that upwards of 36 children have been suggested at one time or another as being illegitimate children of George's, an improbably high number. Some of these claims were more credible than others. For example, in his twilight years, George claimed he had a son who was serving in the British colonies in the West Indies as a naval officer. Another alleged son was James Ord, who became a Jesuit priest in the United States. If these were George's children, his conduct towards them, as with so much else, was not good. At least where previous monarchs like Charles II had sired many illegitimate children, he had provided extensively for them, even if they could not succeed him. This didn't happen with George. The gap between the time when Fitzherbert was dismissed by letter and when George became officially engaged was very short. By the end of 1794, the negotiations for him to marry Caroline, a daughter of the Duke of Brunswick in the German aristocracy, were complete. They were first cousins, as her mother, Augusta, was George's aunt, the sister of the king. A marriage of such close consanguinity, though, was not unusual for royal unions in either late medieval or early modern times, and continued to be considered normal into the early 20th century. They were married in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace on the 8th of April 1795. It was an inauspicious beginning. George, who had clearly not responded well on first meeting his future bride, got senselessly drunk the night of the wedding. Instead of consummating the marriage, he appears to have fallen into the fireplace of their marital bedroom. By the following morning, he was conscious enough to take his wife to bed. Almost exactly 9 months to the day thereafter, on the 7th of January 1796, Caroline gave birth to their one and only child, a daughter who they named Charlotte after George's mother. The tumultuous nature of George's personal life was reflected in political and military developments on the continent. When Britain, Austria, Prussia, and others had gone to war with France in 1792 and 1793, they had initially looked as though they would overthrow the revolutionary government. They had, for instance, sparked counter-revolutionary revolts around the country, and the British had invaded the south around Marseille and Toulon, ports which they occupied for a time. But eventually, by initiating a program of national conscription of young men to serve in the military, the French were able to turn the tide, and by 1795 were on the offensive, conquering the Low Countries and advancing to the River Rhine in Western Germany, while a young commander by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte knocked Austria out of the war after a massively successful campaign in northern Italy. By the end of the 1790s, the British were the only major opponent still at war with France. It would continue this way into the 1800s, even as Bonaparte rose to power as a military dictator and then Emperor of the French, with Austria, Prussia, and Russia intermittently at war with France and Britain, alone remaining a perennial opponent of the growing French domination of the continent. George responded in England to these developments by petitioning to be given a position of some responsibility in the British war effort. His younger brother Frederick, the Duke of York, had been made a general in 1793, following Britain's entry into the war against France, and saw active combat in the Flanders campaign of 1794, where a British expeditionary force was trying to prevent the French advance into the Netherlands. In 1795, he was promoted to commander-in-chief. George bristled at his brother's promotion and requested to be given a command himself. His father refused. For once, This was not out of disdain for the Prince of Wales's conduct, and was simply due to concerns that the heir to the throne would be killed in combat. At home, things were not good either. By the time Caroline gave birth to their daughter, George and she were already living apart. A string of mistresses followed, and by 1800, the heir had drifted back to none other than Maria Fitzherbert, the woman he had married back in 1785. Caroline and George would not have any further children, and it soon became clear that George had married her solely for the purposes of having his debts relieved, and to put on the appearance of fulfilling his duties as the first in line to the throne. Once an heir of his own was produced, he seemed to have considered his marital responsibilities fulfilled, and while he did not seek a divorce, there was no real marriage to speak of after a few months. Eventually, this created controversy of another kind. In the course of the 1800s, Caroline began to strike back at her wayward husband. Living in her own household in Montague House at Blackheath, rumours soon began to circulate that she had taken lovers of her own. Such were the gender and sexual politics of the time, that while George's behaviour was viewed askance by the public and political community, it was deemed totally unacceptable for Caroline to respond by doing the exact same thing. Moreover, this was not the only issue. Caroline's general conduct was eccentric during these years. For instance, in 1802, she adopted a boy called William Austin and took him into Montague House, a peculiar thing for a royal to do at the time. It led some to speculate that Austin was actually her son from an affair. There were also claims by Sir John Douglas and his wife, who lived next to Montague House, that Caroline had sent them obscene and aggressive letters. Alarmed, George decided to order an investigation into Caroline's behaviour and what was going on at Montague House. Although this concluded that Austin was not Caroline's son, there was sufficient evidence of her erratic behaviour and of her sponsoring of political opponents of her husband that her access to their daughter, Princess Charlotte, was severely restricted. Thereafter, she was only allowed a supervised visit once a week. Several years later, once the Napoleonic Wars were drawing to a close, Caroline would elect to leave England altogether and spent much of the 1810s in exile on the continent, visiting North Africa and the Levant. The rumours and hearsay concerning George's estranged wife were just one pressure that the royal family was facing in the 1800s. Another was the deteriorating health of the King and Queen's youngest daughter, Princess Amelia. She eventually died in the early winter of 1810 after a long battle with tuberculosis. This, along with the deteriorating relationship between king and prince, drove George III into his final bout of severe illness. During Accession Day celebrations on the 25th of October 1810, he appeared agitated and was talking manically, making little sense at times. Then, in the weeks that followed, he slipped away from the world, becoming unintelligible. He would live for another 10 years, but George III was never again of sound mind, spending the remainder of his life secluded, often having elaborate conversations with people who were long dead. The king's final illness ushered in the Regency period, as the 1810s are known. After weeks of deliberation over Christmas and New Year, a Regency Act was passed by Parliament in early February 1811. Through this, Prince George became the regent and the king in all but name, a dispensation which had first been proposed over 20 years earlier and which was now determined upon. The Regency began in a troubled fashion. Britain was still at war with France, and a fresh conflict with the United States was looming, owing to British insistence on boarding American merchant ships in the Atlantic as part of its naval blockade of France. This would boil over into the War of 1812 a year into the Regency. Elsewhere, George flip-flopped politically in the early years of his time as regent, having earlier been allied with the more liberal Whigs, now instead throwing in his lot with the conservative Tories in 1812. All of this culminated on the 11th of May 1812 when the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, was assassinated in the House of Commons by John Bellingham, a merchant from Liverpool holding a personal grudge against the administration. Though Bellingham had acted alone, the event led to considerable unrest and fears of a wider conspiracy. All in all, it was an unstable beginning to the Regency. Surely one of the great successes of the Regency was the successful conclusion of the seemingly never-ending conflict with France. When George became regent in 1810, Napoleon was master of most of Europe, having humiliated Austria and Prussia and stripped them of massive amounts of territory in multiple wars. Only Russia remained a threat to him on the continent. And so, in an effort to reduce them to his rule, Bonaparte invaded Russia in the summer of 1812. The campaign was disastrous. Although he captured Moscow in the late autumn, the Russians refused to surrender. Not predicting this, the French eventually fled back to Poland as the winter set in and their supplies dwindled. With his army in ruins, Europe's powers united and conquered Napoleon's empire in the course of 1813 and early 1814. A first abdication occurred in April 1814, after which he made a second grasp for power in 1815, all to no avail, as the British and Prussians inflicted the final defeat on him at the Battle of Waterloo that summer. In the months that followed, George, as regent, was front and centre in the many official celebrations of the victory. These continued in the years that followed, as commemorations were held into 1816 and 1817. Notably, the rebranding of the Strand Bridge across the River Thames in London as Waterloo Bridge. The man who would soon become George IV was many things, not all of them good, but historians are generally agreed that as a ruler, he was one of the great patrons of the arts and architecture, certainly to a greater extent than his father. George III was a cultured man himself, though of a more inquisitive nature, and he enjoyed more the work of scientists and engineers who seemed to be devising new machines for the Industrial Revolution every year. Instead, the regent was more interested in patronizing painters, architects, and other designers. Sir Thomas Lawrence, who owed his knighthood to George, was the court painter of the 1810s and 1820s, and many famous portraits of George and other leading royals and aristocrats of the age were painted by him. Joseph Constable and J.M.W. Turner also earned royal commissions during the Regency era, notably Turner's 1819 painting, Richmond Hill, on the Prince Regent's birthday, which was displayed at Somerset House on completion. There were other developments in architecture and furniture design in the 1810s, though surely the grandest expression of Regency culture and George's patronage of it was the development of Regent's Park in London. In the 1810s, George employed John Nash to begin laying out a grand new park just to the west of King's Cross in the capital. Much of the financing later came from James Burton, yet the Regent's role in commencing the project was considerable, and it formed part of a wider programme of urban design in this part of London north of the Thames during the 1810s and 1820s, which George could claim credit for. Though George's patronage of the arts can only be partly credited with creating an atmosphere conducive to it, the Regency era is remarkable in British culture for the literature of the period. The 1810s witnessed an enormous output from some of England's greatest writers and poets. The Romantic poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge were already producing some of their best work in the 1790s and 1800s, and continued to do so in the 1810s, notably with Coleridge finally publishing Kublai Khan in 1816. Though he had started it 20 years earlier, Lord Byron began writing Don Juan at the end of the 1810s, and virtually everything that Percy Bysshe Shelley produced in his short life was published during the Regency period. Jane Austen produced her greatest work in the 1810s. Sense and Sensibility was published in 1811, Pride and Prejudice in 1813, Mansfield Park in 1814, and Emma in 1816. Sir Walter Scott published both Rob Roy and Ivanhoe in the late 1810s. Finally, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published on New Year's Day 1818, offering an early classic of Gothic horror and a critical commentary on the growing technological development and industrialization of England. Few decades have seen such a profusion of literary classics in such a small country. 17 was a difficult year for George. His and Caroline's marriage had only resulted in one child, Princess Charlotte, who was, as a result, George's heir and second in line to the throne after George. With George III expected to die soon, and George himself being a man well into his 50s and not exactly in good health owing to his hedonistic lifestyle over the years, it could be reasonably expected that Charlotte would become queen in the not too distant future. The subject of her marriage was a tense one during the Regency period. George wanted her to marry Prince William of Orange, the future king of the Netherlands, but Charlotte, who had very much inherited her father's obstinacy, refused the match and eventually married Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld instead, a German noble who would subsequently become the first King of Belgium in 1831. The union took place in 1816, and Charlotte soon became pregnant. On the 5th of November 1817, she gave birth to a stillborn baby boy. Despite the initial emotional trauma of this, Charlotte seemed to be physically fine. However, late that night, she suddenly became violently ill from postpartum bleeding, and she died in the early hours of the 6th of November. With this, George's only direct legitimate heir was gone, and the succession was once more thrown open to debate, with it now seeming likely that when George himself died, one of his siblings would succeed. George's time as regent drew to a close with one of the most violent episodes in modern English domestic history. While England was a constitutional monarchy and had been in large part since the civil wars of the 17th century, this was not a democracy in the modern sense. The right to vote was extremely limited, and only men of a particular income or wealth could exercise the franchise. In some poor districts, people were elected as members of parliament, with barely anyone there being qualified to vote for them, a development which gave rise to the concept of rotten boroughs. This, combined with economic difficulties in the late 1810s, arising from the Corn Laws and a post-war slump, led to the organisation of a massive political protest at St. Peter's Field in Manchester on the 16th of August 1819. The authorities completely overreacted and ordered a large cavalry charge into the gathered crowd of well over 50,000 people. 18 people were killed and hundreds injured. In the aftermath of it, George foolishly agreed to the Home Secretary, Henry Addington's request that he issue a declaration stating that the Manchester authorities had been correct in how they responded to the protest. The Peterloo Massacre foreshadowed a century of unrest amongst the English industrial working class. Old King George III finally died on the 29th of January 1820. He was 81 years of age at the time of his passing. As a consequence, George himself was already 57 years old when he formally ascended as King George IV. Owing to numerous constitutional changes during the previous reign, his formal titles were King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and King of Hanover. Despite having had a decade to prepare for the inevitable change of monarch, George's coronation was not held for another year and a half, only being held at Westminster Abbey on the 19th of July 1821. The large wait may have been because of the extensive planning required to organise what is generally believed to have been the most lavish and expensive royal coronation in English and British history. George wanted the whole affair to exceed the coronation of Napoleon in Paris back in December 1804, a statement that the Emperor of the French had been vanquished during his regency. Important elements of this included the fashioning of a new crown replete with 12,000 diamonds, the holding of a banquet for 2,000 guests, and large celebrations in London. The whole affair cost nearly £250,000, tens of millions of pounds, in modern monetary terms. One of the more unusual features of the coronation was that George's wife had not been crowned as Queen Consort alongside him. This was not for want of trying. After years absent on the continent, Caroline had speedily made her way back to England to take up her position as Queen upon the death of King George III. This did not mean that her husband was welcoming of her. On the coronation day, the new King ordered the guards at the entrances to Westminster Abbey to prevent her from entering and attempting to take part in the ceremony. This followed efforts in Parliament in 1820 to have Caroline officially sanctioned for having committed adultery during her years in exile. Further controversy was only avoided when Caroline died 3 weeks later on the 7th of August. Her sudden demise and the circumstances in which it took place led inevitably to wagging tongues claiming that she had been poisoned, perhaps on the king's orders. There is no evidence to support this contention though, and Caroline is understood to have been suffering from cancer, which may have been the true cause of her death at 53 years of age. A peculiar element of the new accession was that George was surprisingly popular for a time. This must have come as a shock to a figure that had been reviled in most circles for many years on account of his dissolute habits and his controversial marriage. However, the London crowd seemed genuinely enthused by the prospect of a new king. After the long 60-year reign of George III, and it was noted by many observers and letter writers in the summer of 1821 that George was cheered on his coronation day, while the London crowds jeered Queen Caroline as she was shuttled away from Westminster Abbey having been refused entry to the ceremony. This popularity extended to Ireland and Scotland. George visited Ireland immediately after the coronation celebrations had ended in England, arriving there in mid-August 1821 and staying for 3 weeks. It was the first visit by an English monarch to Ireland since 1690, and the first time that an English monarch had ever arrived there without an army. A carefully stage-managed set of events in Dublin engendered a lot of support for the new king and established a template for how royal visits to the country would be carried out over the next 90 years. Buoyed by the success of the royal visit, George undertook a similar trip to Scotland a year later. Again, it was the first royal visit to the country in a long time. The last visit there had also been less than auspicious, that being when King Charles II had been there in 1651, during the Third English Civil War, as he tried to wrest control of Britain back from Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarians. George's visit was similarly stage-managed here, with paintings produced afterwards to commemorate it, though David Wilkie's subsequent portrait of George, in a Scottish kilt, flattered the monarch by omitting the pink tights he had actually worn under his kilt in Edinburgh. Though it is often unremarked on, the time when George IV was king in the 1820s was an important era in the growth of the British Empire. Admittedly, there were not the same kind of acquisitions as had been seen in the second half of the 18th century, when India was largely conquered and Australia was first colonized, nor those of the late 19th century, when Britain seemed to acquire vast territories in Africa every other year. But there were still some notable developments. The enclave where Sir Stamford Raffles had begun developing a port at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula in 1819, transformed into the colony of Singapore during these years, and the northern borders of the British Raj continued to expand, preparing the way for British efforts to move into what are now Pakistan and Afghanistan in mid-century. A number of British colonies in Western Africa, around Sierra Leone, Gambia, and Ghana, were formed into British West Africa in 1821, which, along with the newly acquired colony in Southern Africa, constituted Britain's first major African colonies. On a perhaps more benign note, the 1820s were crucial in the revitalization of the abolitionist movement in England, after something of a hiatus during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The Anti-Slavery Society was established in Britain in 1823. 10 years later, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed by the British Parliament, beginning the process whereby slavery was abolished across the world. George was in his tomb for 3 years when the act was passed, but the years of his kingship were vital in the evolution of it. George's methods as king were typically unorthodox. Kings by this time were expected to use a wide secretariat and to work in association with parliamentary staff and government ministers. Instead of doing this, George came to rely to an unusually large degree on Sir William Knighton, a figure who first rose as his physician back around the start of the Regency, and then was successively appointed as Auditor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Private Secretary to the King, and Keeper of the Privy Purse. This gave him a virtual monopoly over managing the royal finances in the 1820s. He did a good job in this respect, it must be acknowledged, and by 1825, George was allegedly debt-free for the first time in his adult life. Knighton's hold over the king, though, aroused concern amongst others. Often, George would prevaricate on making important government decisions until he had consulted with him in private, and he seemed to be a constant presence in the mechanics of the royal household. There were also a number of occasions on which Knighton was dispatched on mysterious missions to the continent by his royal patron. Further details about the relationship between the king and his secretary are hard to establish, however. Knighton's widow saw to that when she committed an awful crime from a historian's perspective, and destroyed most of her husband's papers, which included significant tranches of George's own private papers years later. In 1827, political turmoil gripped British politics. In April that year, the long-serving Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, was forced to stand down after 15 years in office when he suffered a stroke. At a time when the monarch still had a substantial say in who the Prime Minister would be, George indicated his support for the Foreign Secretary, George Canning, who duly succeeded despite the greater support for both Sir Robert Peel and Britain's wartime hero, the Duke of Wellington, in Parliament. The appointment caused chaos at Westminster, as dozens of ministers and junior ministers refused to serve under Canning, and a minority government of both Whigs and Tories had to be cobbled together. In the end, the crisis was only resolved when Canning died from tuberculosis after just 119 days in office. George's poor decision-making on this occasion earned him the enmity of the Tories, the party he had leaned towards politically for support in Parliament for the remainder of his reign. This was compounded when the Duke of Wellington finally became Prime Minister early in 1828. George's relationship with the Duke was made worse by the King's insistence that he had fought at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 in disguise and had been integral to victory in a battle where Wellington had been the British commander. This was clearly a lie, though whether the King was simply trying to rile Wellington by maintaining it, or genuinely thought he could convince people of this has never been fully resolved. Wellington would outlive George in office. The King was already in very poor health by the late 1820s, plagued by gout, an inflamed bladder, and, some have speculated, a much milder form of the porphyria, which had most likely been the source of his father's great illness. This was all, compounded by his diet and habits, which were primarily centered in the 1820s on large amounts of brandy, port, wine, and champagne, meals that mostly consisted of meat, and laudanum on an almost daily basis to sleep. He was clinically obese by this time, and portraits from his later life were doctored to flatter the King, with George often dressed in such a manner as to disguise his weight, and his complexion clearly not resembling the pale and corpulent individual he had become. He died on the 26th of June 1830, at 67 years of age, from what is ultimately understood to have been a ruptured blood vessel, which led to major gastrointestinal bleeding. After the standard repose in state and preparations, he was laid to rest in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel at Windsor on the 15th of July 1830, alongside his father. Although George had many biological children, like many other English monarchs before him, they were the product of relationships with women other than his wife. His only legitimate child had sadly died many years before his own passing, and illegitimate children were disbarred from succeeding to the throne. Therefore, his direct line died out as far as the succession was concerned, and he was succeeded by his younger brother as King William IV. William was already 64 years of age when he came to the throne, and was not expected to rule for long in an era when life expectancies were not much more than 70 years, for even the most affluent and healthiest in society. Moreover, like his older brother, he did not have legitimate children. Thus, when he died 7 years later in 1837, the succession fell to the daughter of his and George's brother, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, who had himself died back in 1820. This was the 18-year-old Victoria. She would rule as Queen Victoria and First Empress of India down to 1901, her name becoming attached to the age in which the country's empire was at its height during her 63 years on the throne, given how George's short reign was sandwiched. In between the enormously long ones of his father and niece, he stood little chance of being remembered by the public for very long. George IV is one of Britain's most obscure monarchs in many ways. Rising to the throne in 1820, when he was already in his late 50s, he ruled for just 10 years, and his reign was dwarfed by the 60-year rule of his father between 1760 and 1820, and his niece's even longer 63-year reign between 1837 and 1901. Furthermore, the 1820s were a period of comparative tranquility in British and European affairs, without any major wars or crises that George might have played a role in resolving. These issues aside, he did have his accomplishments, most notably as a patron of the arts. The 1810s and 1820s, when he was regent and then king, were vibrant decades in terms of English literature. He also, it must be said, stepped up to the mark when he needed to in the 1810s, as his father's final illness became completely debilitating. But it had taken him a very long time to reach maturity. For much of his life, George was a playboy, running up absolutely huge debts through his gambling and lifestyle, and failing to perform his duties as a married prince. He was also unquestionably an alcoholic, though the term did not exist in an age when drinking every day, though not to excess, was considered completely normal. Overall, while he had some accomplishments in the second half of his life, he was no great monarch. Luckily, by that time, Parliament ruled England, not the King. William, later known as King William IV of the United Kingdom and Hanover, came into the world just past midnight on August 21st, 1765, at Buckingham House, now Buckingham Palace, in London. His dad, King George III, was ruling Britain and Ireland, while his mum, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was raising a big family. As the third son, William's shot at the throne seemed slim, but his wild naval career and lively personality carved out a unique path, as we'll dive into below. His father was King George III of Britain and Ireland, who took the crown in 1760. At age 22, the third king from the Hanoverian Dynasty, a German family linked to England's Tudors and Scotland's Stuarts. William's father was the first Hanoverian born in England. Their German roots meant Britain's kings in the 18th and early 19th centuries also governed Hanover, a key northern German principality where William would later make his mark. William's mother, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, wed George III in 1761, soon after he became king. Their marriage produced a sprawling family. Before William, two sons, George in 1762 and Frederick in 1763, were born, placing William III in line to the throne, reducing his chances of ruling. George III and Charlotte had 15 children in total, with most surviving into their 60s and 70s, a rare achievement for the 18th century. Their home life was warm, with George and Charlotte's bond notably tight, though later strained by the king's health struggles. William grew up as Britain surged to global prominence. In the late medieval era, England was a minor kingdom on Europe's edge. A traveller from Mughal India or Qing China in the 1600s would have seen a rural, poor land with only London standing out. Yet by then, England was expanding, planting colonies in North America and the Caribbean, trading along Africa's west coast and in India, and profiting from the Atlantic slave trade, a practice William's life and reign would later confront. Britain's global influence exploded around William's birth. In the late 1750s, the English East India Company seized much of Bengal and northeastern India, laying the foundation for the British Raj. The Royal Navy was becoming a worldwide force. 3 years after William's birth, James Cook's South Seas expedition paved the way for British claims in Australia and New Zealand, while the Industrial Revolution began around 1770. William's life spanned Britain's rise from an emerging power to a global empire. A key rivalry shaped William's life: Britain versus France. By the mid-18th century, both nations competed for the same regions. Britain's 13 colonies from New England to Georgia, France's Louisiana and Canada, both held Caribbean islands and sought dominance in India. In Europe, Britain allied with the Dutch Republic and Austria to check French ambitions. Historians call this a Second Hundred Years' War, 1688-1815, fiercer than the first, 1337-1453. Britain gained ground with the 1763 Treaty of Paris, ending the 7 Years' War, securing Canada and supremacy in northeastern India. But unrest in the 13 colonies sparked war in 1775, with France backing the rebels, a conflict William joined, living amid constant Anglo-French tensions. William's early years were spent in various households, raised by tutors and governors, as was typical for royals. At 7, he got his own household at Kew Green, near London. Major General Boudet, a Swiss officer from Hanover's army, and Dr. James Magendie handled his education from ages 7 to 13. Their teaching was solid but uninspired, and William was never seen as a refined monarch. He studied with his younger brothers, Edward and Ernest, with whom he clashed. Edward was distant and sharp, Ernest argued with both, and William was hot-headed. Discipline was strict, typical for the time. William grew close to his sister Augusta, born 3 years later. With 15 siblings born over 2 decades, William's bonds varied. He was a favourite of his sisters, likely due to his easygoing charm and quick apologies for any missteps. Unusual by modern standards, William's father sent him to the Royal Navy in 1778 at age 12. In the 18th century, adulthood began, around 13, so this wasn't odd. More importantly, George III wanted to shield his sons from their eldest brother, George, whose wild behaviour worried the king. To prevent its influence on potential future kings, William joined the Navy just before turning 13. George III instructed Sir Samuel Hood, then a Portsmouth Dockyards commissioner, to treat William like any sailor without pomp. But as third in line to the throne, equal treatment was impossible. Everyone knew his status. William's early service focused on the American Revolutionary War, sparked in 1775 by colonial anger over taxes and lack of representation. By 1778, the war was intense, with American wins at Saratoga in 1777 threatening British control of the 13 colonies. France joined the rebels in March 1778, aiding them with naval power. In June 1779, William joined the Prince George, Admiral Robert Digby's flagship, as a cadet, just shy of 14. He escorted British merchant ships in the eastern Atlantic against French and Spanish attacks. In January 1780, he fought in a clash with Spanish ships as Admiral Rodney resupplied Gibraltar, a British stronghold since the early 1700s. There, William got into a brawl, landing briefly in jail. Returning to England, he was hailed for his efforts. In 1781, the Prince George headed to North America, stationing William in British-held New York City during the war's later stages. His presence caught George Washington's eye. As the siege of Yorktown began in September 1781, a decisive moment, Washington learned William roamed Manhattan, often unguarded, visiting Commodore Edmund Affleck's house. Washington greenlit a plan to kidnap William to free colonial prisoners, even as Yorktown ended and peace talks progressed. British intelligence likely foiled the plot by tightening William's security, an intriguing encounter between a future US president and a future British king. George III aimed for William to rise high in the Navy, perhaps as an admiral, but William's 1780s naval record was mediocre. He became a decent officer, commanding a small ship, but his royal status spared him criticism, limiting his growth. Like his brothers, he took to heavy drinking, beyond normal for the era. In 1788, dining with his nephew-in-law, future King Leopold I of Belgium, William quipped against drinking water at his table. His drinking caused trouble. In Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1788, he fathered a son with an unknown woman and reportedly visited every brothel in town. In Barbados in the mid-1780s, he trashed a brothel during a drunken spree, an act that would have led to a court-martial for others. In 1787, he sent a brash letter to Hood, upset over a missed promotion. Hood replied politely, sidestepping the issue. By 1788, after a Caribbean tour where he backed slavery for the sugar economy, William's naval days tapered off. On May 1st, 1789, he was named Duke of Clarence, a title once held by sons of Edward III and Henry IV. This followed a strange move where he threatened to join the House of Commons, a bold tactic to secure a noble title and lord's seat, as royals in the Commons were unthinkable. Nearing 24, he got a $12,000 yearly pension and St. James's Palace apartments. In the Lords, he leaned toward the liberal Whigs, like his brothers, irking his Tory-leaning father. William's flirtation with entering the House of Commons had come at a time when neither his father nor the government in general needed such petty distractions. In the summer of 1788, George III had begun acting in a peculiar fashion. Not long afterwards, the Parliament had been prorogued for several months, with those aware of the situation hoping that this would provide time for the king to rest and recover from whatever was ailing him. He did not. Instead, his condition deteriorated further, and by the late autumn, matters had reached a crisis point. The cause of George's affliction has been widely discussed for over 2 centuries, yet never concretely resolved. During his bouts of illness, he became manic at times, and then pensive and depressed on other occasions. Sometimes he would talk incessantly for hours, but not in a conversational manner. The most plausible explanation, based on reports of his urine being severely discolored in later years and the nature of his symptoms, is that he was suffering from porphyria, a liver disease. This was leading to a build-up of toxins in his system that caused him to descend into periods of mania. The Regency crisis of 1788 resolved itself early in 1789, when he seemed to make a full recovery, and the bill which government ministers had been preparing to allow the Prince of Wales, William's brother, to rule in his father's stead, was shelved. Yet it was not the end of the problem. King George's bouts of mania and illness would return on numerous occasions, and, as we will see, they eventually led to his reign effectively ending in 1810. 10 years before his death. Not long after his father's recovery and his brief efforts to enter the House of Commons, William began a relationship with an Irish woman by the name of Dorothea Bland. She hailed from Waterford in the south of Ireland, though she had spent most of her life in England and had become a figure on the London stage. As an actress, she had changed her name to Dora Jordan, evidently deciding that Bland was not a suitable surname for a thespian. William's relationship with a commoner was controversial and the subject of numerous satirical cartoons in the British newspapers in the 1790s. It was also not his first unconventional relationship. As we have seen, prior to meeting Jordan, while he was away at sea, he had fathered an illegitimate child, the mother of whom is unknown today. Named William after his father, this son would drown while serving in the Royal Navy off Madagascar. In 1807, in 1791, over the protestations of his mother and father, William settled down at Clarence Lodge in Roehampton with Jordan, married in all but name. Later, they lived at Bushy House in Teddington in London in the 1800s. They would have 10 illegitimate children, each of whom was given the surname Fitzclarence, Fitz meaning son, and Clarence being a reference to William's senior-most aristocratic title. This was an established practice for illegitimate royal children. Illegitimate sons and daughters of previous monarchs, for instance, were given the name Fitzroy, effectively meaning son of the king. William and Dorothea's large family would fare well. The eldest, George Fitzclarence, was made Earl of Munster in 1831. A daughter, Sophia, married the Baron de Lisle and Dudley. Another son, Adolphus Fitzclarence, became a rear admiral in the Royal Navy. William was a complex individual. He was not as difficult a figure as his eldest brother. George was. The future George IV was an alcoholic and a deeply irresponsible individual in many respects. However, William had his own issues. Friends and acquaintances described him as hard-headed and obstinate when he had a firm view on a matter. He could also become impatient easily. At the same time, he had a kind of humility and disliked decorum in a refreshing manner for a member of the royal family, something which he probably acquired from his mother. He was a xenophobic individual. Years later, when he became king, he insisted on replacing many of the royal staff with English men and women. In this, he was shaped by his experiences in North America, where he developed an antipathy towards the colonial community, and also by the prevailing anti-French sentiment that was common in England during the 18th century. Contemporaries referred to him as Silly Billy, though this was probably unfair. While he was not possessed of a great intellect, William was not unintelligent either. A prevalent issue surrounding him was his indebtedness during the 1790s and 1800s. Much of this was owing to his personal reckless spending during these years, though a fair share of the blame lies with Dorothea as well. Many years later, when they separated and he married, he turned himself around in this respect and became a model of financial restraint amongst the royals. While William was settling down with Dorothea as his mistress in the 1790s, Europe was descending into complete chaos. Ultimately, what was occurring would see Britain emerge victorious against the French in the Second Hundred Years' War, a conflict in which William had played his role during the 1780s in North America, while French involvement on the side of the Patriots in the American Revolutionary War and the emergence of the independent United States had been a great coup for the French against the British. Financing it had added to an economic crisis that had been brewing in France for decades. This climaxed in the late 1780s as harvest failures and other issues ensured that King Louis XVI had no option except to convene the Estates General, the French Parliament, for the first time in 175 years. When it met in the summer of 1789, the French Revolution soon began as the king and his ministers quickly lost control of the situation and were sidelined by the Third Estate. The revolution became more and more radical in the early 1790s. Two things led to a descent into a general European war. Firstly, there was unwillingness amongst powers like Britain to accept such a radical political experiment in a country like France, one which many feared might act as an inspiration to the commons of countries like England to revolt against their own governments. Secondly, Queen Marie Antoinette of France was an Austrian princess and had effectively been under house arrest in Paris since the autumn of 1789. The Austrians consequently led the formation of a coalition, which in 1792 went to war with the French. This was the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars. These would eventually morph into the Napoleonic Wars, which in turn lasted down to 1815. Thus, a quarter of a century of William's life, as for all Europeans, was lived in the shadow of the French Revolution and the wars that followed. When Britain joined Austria and Prussia in their war against France early in 1793, there were questions as to whether or not William would return to sea. His younger brother Edward chose the option of military service during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, serving in North America throughout the 1790s, and then being appointed as governor of the British fortress at the Rock of Gibraltar in 1802. In contrast, William did not take up a naval position in 1793. This was partly owing to a self-inflicted injury. William had recently fallen down a staircase while drunk and broken his arm. The greater reason, though, was that the head of the Admiralty, Lord Hood, with whom William had clashed back in 1787, simply did not want William to be given a naval command. It would politicize the Navy to an overt degree, and there were also serious competency issues. Hood and others who knew William from his time serving in the 1780s quite simply did not believe he had the makings of a good admiral or captain. The excuse Hood and others needed for this decision was provided in 1793 when William gave a speech in the House of Lords in which he spoke in a veiled way against British involvement in the war, a view held by many Whigs in England at the time. Thus, although his father pushed for it, George was effectively blocked from returning to active service at sea during the French Revolutionary Wars. On this count, he hardly merits the name the Sailor King, which some contemporaries and many historians have bestowed on him. That said, he did continue to play a role in naval matters from dry land. During the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars, William acted as a patron of numerous seamen, Lord Nelson included, and he would eventually, after many years of seeking a senior naval position, gain appointment as Lord High Admiral much later in his life. The French Revolutionary Wars eventually gave way to the Napoleonic Wars in the late 1790s. The change came about as one of the many prominent French generals that emerged in the 1790s. Napoleon Bonaparte seized control of the French Republic late in 1799. He established what was known as the First Consulate. It was a military dictatorship in all but name. Later he proclaimed himself Emperor of the French in 1804, and in the years that followed conquered virtually all of Europe, leaving Britain and Russia as the only countries that had not been fully reduced to French domination. As all of this occurred, the position of the Royal Navy became more and more important. A French invasion of Britain or Ireland could only be staved off at sea, and might have come about had it not been for Nelson's great victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Watching all of this, William periodically expressed a desire to return to sea, and at one point petitioned for command over the Mediterranean fleet. His efforts were blocked yet again. Meanwhile, his debts continued to grow, compounded by the fact that Dorothea, who had a successful career as an actress for many years, was no longer in demand on the London stage to any great degree, and her spending had become much greater than her own income. By the end of the 1800s, it was clear that William was considering marriage to a wealthy heiress to relieve his financial position. Parliament certainly would not help him any further at a time when the indebtedness of George III's many children had led to political resistance to using the public purse to aid them in their financial distress, particularly so in a time of war. 10 and 1811 were tumultuous years for William and his family. The youngest of William's sisters, Amelia, had been in poor health for many years. In 1809 and 1810, matters deteriorated further, and she died on the 2nd of November 1810 at 27 years of age. Her deteriorating health devastated her father, who slipped into another bout of mania and incapacity in October 1810, shortly before Amelia died. He never recovered from this. George III would spend the last 10 years of his life in a world in which he did not recognize reality. His eldest son George, Prince of Wales, formally became regent and began ruling on his father's behalf in 1811. This situation would prevail for nearly 10 years, down to 1820. Not long afterwards, on the 23rd of December 1811, a formal deed of separation outlining the financial provisions of their split was agreed upon between William and Dorothea. After 20 years and no marriage, they went their separate ways. Even as the pressure on William to finally marry was growing, she would eventually move to France and died there in the summer of 1816. That she was able to do so points to the other major development of these years, the end of the wars with France. Napoleon overstretched his hand when he invaded Russia in 1812, and his continental empire collapsed in 1813 and 1814. After a brief return to power in the spring and summer of 1815, he lost power for the last time after the Battle of Waterloo. William was made an admiral in the later years of the war, but it was in a purely ceremonial capacity. In 1818, William finally married at 52 years of age. There were numerous reasons for this belated decision. His long-standing mistress, Dorothea Jordan, had died in the summer of 1816 from a ruptured blood vessel. Much more consequential was the death on the 6th of November 1817 of Princess Charlotte, the daughter and sole heir of Prince George. Even though George III still had 12 living children, Charlotte was his only legitimate surviving grandchild at that time. Thus, if William or one of his siblings did not begin producing children within wedlock, there was a possibility the family line would die out one day. The responsibility for saving it fell primarily to the male members of the House of Hanover, as most of the childbearing years of William's sisters were behind them by that time. Parliament even offered financial incentives to William and his brother Edward if they would marry, and so, on the 11th of July 1818, the pair married in a joint ceremony at Kew Palace in Surrey. William's bride was Adelaide of the House of Saxe-Meiningen in central Germany. At 25 years of age, she was less than half William's age. The union proved a reasonably good one. She had a stabilizing influence on William. He drank less, and they moved for a time to the Hanoverian lands of the family in northern Germany, where they lived frugally as William tried to live within his means for once. Alas, the one thing the marriage did not result in was healthy children. Adelaide had a tumultuous natal history over the first 5 years of their marriage. A daughter born in March 1819 lived only a few hours, and there were several stillbirths and miscarriages. The closest they came to having a healthy child was Elizabeth, who was born in December 1820 but died the following spring. William and Adelaide were going through this unpleasant experience as the situation with the succession was changing again. On the 29th of January 1820, William's father died at 81 years of age. Old King George III had not ruled in nearly 10 years and had spent most of his later years in a shadow world, conversing with people that were long dead. With his death, William's brother finally ascended as King George IV in his own right. By the time his long-delayed coronation took place on the 19th of July 1821, tongues were already wagging about how long the new king would be around for. George IV was an alcoholic who, by the time he became ruler of Britain, was suffering from a range of associated illnesses, not least obesity. He had no heir since the death of his daughter in 1817, and was unlikely to produce one now. If George died, the throne would pass to William's other older brother Frederick, but his marriage had proved childless, and so William was the second in line to the throne from 1820 onwards. Frederick's health was also poor, and many people now viewed William, whose adoption of a healthier regimen was in direct contrast to the physical decline of his brothers, as a man who might become king sooner than expected. Despite the changed state of affairs, William and Adelaide continued to elope from England regularly, spending protracted periods of time on the continent in 1822, 1825, and 1826. In April 1827, well over 3 decades after his desire to return, to sea had been frustrated at the start of the French Revolutionary Wars, William was finally granted the high naval office he had always coveted. The Prime Minister, George Canning, Viscount Melville, extended an invitation to become Lord High Admiral of Britain, effectively the head of the Royal Navy. Perhaps Canning had an eye to currying favour with the man who might soon be king, but the Prime Minister himself died just months later. The post of Lord High Admiral had been in abeyance for a time, and reviving it was a political gesture. William's patent of office restricted his powers by forcing him to consult with an Admiralty Council before any major decisions could be taken. Even with these restrictions, William immediately plunged his office into some controversy when he praised Sir Edward Codrington for sinking much of the Turkish fleet at the Battle of Navarino off the western coast of the Peloponnese in the Mediterranean. Codrington had acted without official orders, and his actions dragged Britain into the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. When Britain's wartime hero from the Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington, entered office as Prime Minister in January 1828, he pointedly referred in his first speech to the action at Navarino as an untoward event, something of a rebuke, to William. When William exceeded his remit again months later, Wellington intervened with the king, and George IV wrote to his brother telling him he would have to act more within the constraints imposed by his patent of office. William was upset, but he thereafter turned with some success to administration. It was he, for instance, who as Lord High Admiral commissioned the building of the first steam-powered ship of the Royal Navy. He also introduced some reforms to the gunnery system. Part of the decision to appoint William as Lord High Admiral in 1827 was because by then he was even closer to the throne. His older brother Frederick, the heir to the throne since 1820, died on the 5th of January 1827 of a combination of dropsy and cardiovascular problems. It was clear George would not long outlive him. He had been increasingly consigned to bed for days at a time, was obese, suffered from a range of ailments, and was also going blind. He was also managing on a diet of laudanum for his various ailments and could barely function as monarch. It was consequently not surprising for William when he was woken by an attendant at Bushy House around 6 a.m. on the morning of the 26th of June 1830 and was informed that he was King of Britain. George had died not long before at Windsor Castle. William was an initially popular monarch. He was, after all, succeeding a recluse whose private life had been controversial for decades. Yet William made efforts to boost his popularity. He opened some of the Park of Windsor to the public for the first time, and not long after his accession, held a banquet for 3,000 of the town's poorer inhabitants. His wife's reform of the ostentation he displayed earlier in his life continued, and he managed to reduce the cost of the royal establishment by half. His austerity was such that his coronation, when it was held on the 8th of September 1831, cost just about 10% of the amount George had spent a decade earlier. William loathed ceremony and had wanted to dispense with the event altogether, though he was informed that it was a constitutional requirement. At 66 years of age by then, William was the oldest monarch of England or Britain crowned, until Charles III's coronation in 2022. One of the first major acts of William's reign was to play a role in the Belgian Revolution. There had never been a country of Belgium prior to the 19th century. The lands here had comprised several important medieval duchies and counties in the Middle Ages, such as the County of Flanders, the County of Hainaut, and the Duchy of Brabant. These were conquered by the Dukes of Burgundy in the 14th and 15th centuries. After the Burgundian state dissolved on the extinction of its royal line in 1477, the provinces had passed through the hands of the Spanish and Austrian branches of the House of Habsburg. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Austrian Netherlands, as they had been known for most of the 18th century, were handed over to the Dutch House of Orange-Nassau, effectively as part of the Netherlands. Rule by the Protestant Dutch never suited the Catholics of Belgium, and in August 1830, they revolted and established their own state, naming it after the Gallo-Celtic Belgae tribe that had controlled the region prior to the arrival of the Romans, there in the 1st century BC. To fully resolve the question of Belgian independence, the London Conference was staged in December 1830. Belgian independence was agreed to in principle by the great European powers, but a further question was, who would rule over it? William was a strong advocate for the cause of Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. He was the widower of Princess Charlotte, William's niece, who had died in childbirth back in 1817. Leopold had remained living in England after her passing. Now, he benefited by having his cause promoted by his uncle-in-law, and in 1831 he ascended as Leopold I, King of the Belgians. At home, William had adopted a fairly chaotic political situation. By the early 19th century, some of the broad outlines of the modern British democratic system were in place. The Crown no longer ruled the country, Parliament was in charge, and the executive was headed by a Prime Minister and a cabinet of ministers. However, the monarch of the day still had a much greater role in appointing the prime minister than is the case today. A series of strong prime ministers, like Robert Walpole and William Pitt the Younger, had characterized British politics for much of the 18th century. Since the end of Lord Liverpool's 15-year tenure of the office in April 1827, there had been a much more unstable situation. George Canning and Frederick John Robinson came and went in quick succession before Wellington entered office. He was still there when William became king. However, Wellington was a less capable politician than he had been a military commander, and was replaced in November 1830 by Earl Grey, who in turn was followed by Viscount Melbourne, Wellington again, and finally Robert Peel, all in quick succession. In 1834, in the midst of this rapid turnover of prime ministers, William intervened in 1834 to try and influence parliamentary politics by dissolving the government after John Russell succeeded Lord Althorp as leader of the House of Commons. The king disagreed with Russell's views on the collection of tithes and ecclesiastical taxes in Ireland, where the so-called tithe war was underway, and was reluctant to have him become the leader of the Commons. The move was not shrewd. It is the only time in Britain's modern history that a British monarch has intervened to dissolve a government in this way based on his own personal views. William's actions have not been repeated since. It did, however, pave the way for the rise of Robert Peel as Prime Minister, who became the leading British statesman of the middle of the 19th century. In the midst of this rapid turnover of prime ministers and shifting political landscape in the first half of the 1830s, a number of extremely important pieces of legislation passed through the British Parliament. These were the results of decades of campaigning and lobbying, and it was somewhat coincidental that they passed into law in the early 1830s. The first of these was the Great Reform Act. While Britain was a democracy of a kind by the start of the 19th century, it remained an oligarchic one. Few people were allowed to vote. Women were entirely excluded, and only men of a certain wealth and social status could vote. This was epitomized in the existence of rotten boroughs. In these, the average person was so poor that they did not qualify to vote, often meaning that MPs were elected for these constituencies with virtually nobody there actually voting for them. The Great Reform Act of 1832, which William gave the royal assent to on the 7th of June that year, was a major milestone in the shift towards Britain becoming a full democracy. The income and wealth requirements were considerably reduced, expanding the number of men that could vote in elections. It paved the way for the additional Reform Act of 1867, which would see millions of people voting in Britain in elections for the first time. William was an inherently conservative monarch and was no great fan of the Great Reform Act. It is to his enduring credit that he facilitated the passage of the Act all the same. When it was proposed to him late on in the process that he could block it by creating new peers who could then block the legislation from passage through the House of Lords, he refused to do so. The entire process, though, was very chaotic, with riots occurring in 1831 in London, Derby, Bristol, and Nottingham, when the second bill of the Act failed to pass through Parliament. Hundreds died, and millions of pounds worth of damage was caused in a serious bout of civil unrest. The other major legislative development of William's reign concerned the institution of slavery. For 3 centuries, the transatlantic slave trade had been a feature of English and British life. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, slave traders like John Hawkins emerged, who transported slaves from Western Africa to the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Over time, the English had become much more deeply involved in the trade after they established their own colonies in North America and, above all, in the Caribbean in the 17th century. The War of the Spanish Succession at the start of the 18th century had even led to the British acquiring the asiento, the right to supply the Spanish with slaves in the Americas. Villages like Liverpool and Glasgow were transformed into major trading cities as a result of their role in the slave trade, while the capital generated by the production of sugarcane in the British colonies in the Caribbean funded the early Industrial Revolution to a not insignificant extent. Despite the enormous financial benefits reaped from it, in 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act. This led to a ban on the trading of new slaves in British ships. It still did not go far enough for the abolitionists, and in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, banning the slave trade altogether throughout the British Empire. Over the next half a century, The British Royal Navy even began policing the world's seas in an effort to stop other nations from engaging in the slave trade, though William was the monarch who gave royal assent to the Slavery Abolition Act. On the 28th of August 1833, his personal attitude towards slavery was not exactly enlightened. Years earlier, during his time in the House of Lords, he had spoken on several occasions against the abolition and had referred to leading members of the abolitionist movement as fanatics. In 1799, he had referred to slaves in the Caribbean as living in, quote, a state of humble happiness. He had also visited the Caribbean in the 1780s during his naval career and was on good terms with the planter community there. This planter community was central to why it took 26 years for the ban on the slave trade to be extended to a ban on the institution of slavery altogether. William was on very good terms with the West India Committee, a pressure group set up back in 1780 to resist abolition, and he was an important figure in calling for extensive compensation for the planters in the Caribbean who would be impacted by the abolition. Eventually, the British government agreed to pay out £20 million sterling in compensation, billions of dollars in today's money. William might have given royal assent to the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833 as part of his constitutional duties, but he was opposed to it on a personal level. William was involved in important constitutional developments as well on the continent. Since the accession of King George I as the first ruler of the House of Hanover in Britain in 1714, the rulers of Britain had also been the rulers of Hanover in northern Germany. This was a peculiar constitutional arrangement. The Hanoverian monarchs ruled over Hanover, yet Hanover was not controlled by the British state. Thus, Hanover was broadly ruled by William as a separate state in the 1830s. There was unrest here, at the time of his accession, about the political situation. The burgeoning middle class of industrialists, professionals, and business people were unhappy about the very limited number of nobles in Hanover failing to share political power with them. The opposition continued for several years until William oversaw the adoption of a new constitution for Hanover in 1833. This agreed to share a greater amount of political and economic power among the Hanoverian bourgeois. William's greater legacy in Hanover was to be remembered, and he is marked as the last ruler of Hanover who was simultaneously King of Britain and Ireland. When he died in 1837, he would be succeeded by his niece in Britain. As Hanoverian law forbade a female from succeeding to the throne, Ernest Augustus, William's younger brother, instead succeeded as King of Hanover, splitting the British and Hanoverian thrones, although they continued to be ruled by members of the House of Hanover, down to the formation of the German Empire in 1871. It might stretch matters to suggest that William was a major patron of British culture during his 7-year reign. His older brother, for all his many faults, was a relatively cultured individual, something of a dilettante among the otherwise culturally disinterested late Hanoverian monarchs. William did not emulate him. This stemmed from his own personal habits. Some of William's favourite reading material, for instance, included lighthouse manuals and dense tomes about naval history, ever trying to present himself as the sailor king, even decades after he had last been to sea in any sustained way. It should come as no surprise then to learn that he did not act as a major royal sponsor of writers, artists, or librarians. Nevertheless, the 1830s were a comparatively important period in British cultural output. It was, for example, towards the end of William's reign that a young Charles Dickens published his first works, Sketches by Boz and the Pickwick Papers. Alfred Tennyson continued his emerging career as a poet laureate of 19th century Britain. The utilitarian philosophy movement was at its peak in the final years of the life of Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, while his successor, John Stuart Mill, began formulating his thoughts in the 1830s. The painters, J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, two of the paragons of mature landscape painting, both completed some of their best work during William's reign. Constable was present at the king's coronation. William might not have been a cultured enough man to have tried to promote these individuals or to try and patronize the development of their less successful peers who were in need of financial freedom in order to be able to write, think, and paint. But he also did nothing to impede the press freedom that had developed in Britain during the 18th century. Many works, which would have been blocked by royal censors on the continent, in the 1830s were made freely available to the reading public in William's Britain. William's last years were considerably unhappy ones on a personal level. Most who knew him agreed that William was a good father to his children. Yet many of the 5 sons and 5 daughters that he had with Dorothea Jordan were unhappy with their status after he became king, particularly his eldest son from that relationship, George Fitzclarence. In an effort to assuage his son, William created him as the first Earl of Munster in 1831 and made him a Privy Councillor 2 years later. Still, George remained unhappy, and a rift developed that was compounded by the fact that George was suffering from increasing mental instability, which was probably created by an inherited form of porphyria, of the kind which seems to have led to William's father's psychological decline from the late 1780s onwards. The pain of the rift between father and son grew when William's favourite daughter, Sophia, died in childbirth in April 1837. At almost exactly the same time, William, who was asthmatic, suffered a severe attack. His physicians revealed that his lungs seemed to be full of blood, and his heart was possibly going to give out. Nevertheless, he fought on for 2 more months, like an old lion, as the future Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, described it. He lived long enough to celebrate the 22nd anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. However, things were bad. Enough that day that he was given the sacrament. 2 days later, William died at Windsor Castle at 71 years of age. After lying in state, he was laid to rest in the vault of St. George's Chapel at Windsor. While none described William as a great monarch at the time, there was much talk of the integrity he had restored to the monarchy after the crisis of the Regency, and then his brother George's less than ideal reign in the 1820s. Although William had a large number of children during his lifetime, he had outlived many, and those that were still alive were all illegitimate, born outside of wedlock and unable to succeed him to the throne. Therefore, he was not to be succeeded by any of his children. Moreover, despite the fact that William's father and mother had produced a very large number of children back in the 1760s and 1770s, there were very few plausible heirs left to claim the throne when William died in 1837. Indeed, the foremost claimant was William's young niece Victoria, who had only just turned 18 years of age. Victoria was the daughter of William's younger brother, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. Edward had enjoyed a long military career on land, and had remained a bachelor for much of it, all things which echoed William's own life. Like William, Edward had finally decided to belatedly get married in 1818, for reasons which also mirrored William, namely the need to secure the royal line by producing heirs. Unlike William, Edward's marriage to Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld did result in an heir, a girl named Victoria, after her mother. Thus, on the death of William, young Victoria ascended to the throne, her claim being stronger than William's surviving siblings, each of whom were born after Victoria's father, making their lines more junior in the line of succession. She would rule for the next 63.5 years, the longest reigning monarch of Britain up to that time, and the second longest, after Queen Elizabeth II. Such was the imprint of her reign that the era is known as the Victorian Age, one in which the British Empire was at its absolute height, and its power stretched around the globe. William's short reign has always stood very much in the shadow of his more exalted niece. William IV is one of England and Britain's most obscure monarchs. He was never expected to rule. He had 2 older brothers, George and Frederick, both of whom survived the dangerous years of infancy and childhood when so many people died in early modern times. Once they grew into adulthood, in an age of rapidly improving life expectancy, it was assumed one of them would father numerous children, and then there was no real chance that the throne would ever pass to the third of George III's sons. Consequently, William spent much of his early life as a seaman, serving in North America and elsewhere as a young man in the 1780s, and then as a patron of the Royal Navy at home in England during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars of the 1790s, 1800s, and 1810s. William did not even feel the need to marry and sire his own legitimate children. However, it gradually became clear as the years went by that he might become king after all, particularly so after the death of his niece, George IV's only daughter, Charlotte, in 1817. And so it was. George and Frederick died without heirs. and William became king in 1830. As a man ascending the throne in his mid-60s, his reign was always going to be a short one, but it was not an inconsequential one. In his 7 years on the throne, William oversaw the abolition of the slave trade, though he cannot be given credit for it in any way, and also gave royal assent to the Great Reform Act of 1832. On the international stage, he played a role in the emergence of the Belgian state, and his reign was important in terms of sundering the monarchical ties between Britain and Hanover. That he is a forgotten monarch today is primarily because he is entirely overshadowed by the 60 and 63-year-long reigns of his father and niece, George III and Victoria, which came closely before and immediately after his own reign. Victoria, later celebrated as Queen Victoria, was born on May 24, 1819, at Kensington Palace in the heart of London. Her mom, Princess Victoria Marie-Louise of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, came from a German royal family, while her dad, Prince Edward, was a son of King George III. From a fifth-in-line royal to Britain's iconic monarch, her journey through a changing empire is one we'll dive into below. Her mother hailed from the house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in east-central Germany. A duke's daughter, she had first married Charles, Prince of Leiningen, a small Bavarian state. After his death in 1814, she acted as regent for her young son Karl from that marriage. In 1818, she stepped down from the Regency to wed Prince Edward of Britain. Victoria's father was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, the fourth son of King George III. From the Hanoverian Dynasty, rooted in northern Germany, Edward's father ruled both Britain and Hanover. Though George III spoke English natively and never visited Hanover, when Edward married Princess Victoria in 1818, she became Duchess of Kent. They had one child, Victoria. Edward died of pneumonia in 1820, just 8 months after his daughter's birth. Victoria's mother delivered her at 4:14 a.m. in Kensington Palace's dining room, chosen for its proximity to the kitchen's hot water. Uniquely, a female doctor delivered her, who also delivered her future husband, Prince Albert. At her birth, Victoria was fifth in line to the British throne. She was privately christened on June 24, 1819, by Archbishop Charles Manners Sutton in the palace's cupola room, named Alexandrina Victoria, Alexandrina for her godparent, Tsar Alexander III of Russia, and Victoria for her mother. Known as Her Royal Highness Princess Victoria of Kent, she was a serious, studious child, traits that would serve her well as queen in 1837. The Hanoverians, Victoria's lineage, had ruled Britain since 1714. George III and II were kings of Great Britain, Ireland, and Hanover. Victoria's grandfather, George III, became the first to rule the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland after their 1801 union. Unlike Europe's absolute monarchs, Hanoverians, since the 1688 Glorious Revolution, were constitutional, with lawmaking led by the elected House of Commons and Lords, making Britain a political outlier. George III oversaw vast changes. His reign saw the British Empire's rapid growth, though the American colonies were lost after the War of Independence. European conflicts eased after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815. The Hanoverian era brought industrialization and social shifts, with figures like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who built roads, railways, and the SS Great Britain, Charles Babbage, who invented the first computer, and Alexander Graham Bell, creator of the telephone, driving progress. Before Victoria's 1837 reign, stagecoaches moved goods and people at 12 km/h. Railways during her rule hit 30 km/h by the 1830s and 80 km/h by the 1850s. Steamships brought raw materials to northern cotton mills, introducing exotic goods to British markets. Britain's population soared from 11 million in 1800 to 37 million by 1901, shifting to urban industrial towns, working in factories, mills and mines, fueling the Industrial Revolution. By the Victorian era's end, towns had uniform brick buildings, pavements, streetlights, and most new homes had electricity, running water, drainage, indoor toilets, and gas for cooking. Industrial growth sparked social demands. Trade unions advocated for workers, and reformers pushed for political change. Though women couldn't vote, reforms like secret ballots in 1872 and anti-bribery laws in 1883 opened politics. MPs weren't paid until 1911, limiting working-class representation. Education advanced in the 1870s, with the government mandating schooling for ages 5 to 10, and by 1900, 90% of children attended, though rural kids often missed school for harvests. Religious debates, especially Sunday laws, were rife, with new Catholic and non-Anglican churches built amid growing tolerance. Yet, beneath prosperity, Victorian Britain grappled with poverty, crime, harsh punishments, pollution, prostitution, slums, and begging. Victoria, deeply conservative, opposed social mobility and women's suffrage, calling it a mad folly. Her reign saw the British Navy dominate the seas and the Empire peak, marking the Victorian age as Britain's golden era. At her birth, Victoria's queenship seemed unlikely. By 18, deaths of relatives made her heir. Her uncle, George, Prince of Wales, acted as regent during George III's mental illness, becoming King George IV in 1820. His secret, illegal 1785 marriage to Catholic widow Maria Fitzherbert produced no legitimate heirs. His 1795 marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, though approved, yielded one daughter, Charlotte, before they separated, causing scandal. Charlotte's 1817 death in childbirth, alongside her stillborn son, erased 2 generations of heirs. George, 3 sons raced to produce a legitimate heir. Frederick, Duke of York, had no children and died in 1827. William, Duke of Clarence, married Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, but had no surviving children. Edward, Victoria's father, married Princess Victoria in 1818 to secure the succession. Victoria's mother, already a widow with 2 children, brought her daughter Theodore, Victoria's cherished half-sister. Victoria ranked behind her uncle William IV, his potential children, and her father. Edward's death in January 1820, when Victoria was 8 months old, left the family in debt under Sir John Conroy's control, an ambitious ex-officer claiming Edward's trust. At 4, Victoria began lessons with Reverend George Davies, a patient tutor who fostered her skills. She excelled in French, German, Italian, Latin and English, and took singing lessons from opera star Luigi Lablache and drawing from painter Richard Westall. Her childhood was tightly controlled by her mother and Conroy, who aimed to dominate the throne, especially if Victoria ascended before 18, requiring her mother as regent. The 1830 Regency Act named the Duchess regent if William IV died early, a move William distrusted due to her unpopularity. Strict rules were established to govern the royal household, and Victoria in particular, rules which became known as the Kensington system. As a result of these rules, Victoria grew up in isolation and naivety. All forms of independence were frowned upon, and she was constantly supervised. She wasn't allowed her own bedroom and had to sleep on a small bed in her mother's room. She was not even permitted to walk down the stairs without holding someone's hand in case she fell. Victoria later described her childhood at Kensington Palace as isolating and demoralizing. Given this isolation, the child Victoria had very few friends and was left to entertain herself. Some of Victoria's favorite childhood hobbies included drawing, writing stories, and making costumes for her collection of dolls. With her beloved governess, Baroness Lazen, she also kept a diary and wrote over 60 million words across her lifetime. She spent hours playing on her own or with her little dog, the King Charles Spaniel Dash, and even had trousers made for him. She referred to this time as one of the loneliest of her life, and had only her equally loved governess and her dog for company. Although Victoria grew to resent her isolation and the rules created by Conroy, they did, in some ways, work in her favour. Her mother and Conroy's determination to keep her weak and dependent on them by keeping her away from people they thought undesirable, including her father's family, and especially King William IV, who had several illegitimate children, had backfired. Her absence from court ensured she wasn't associated with her unpopular uncles and predecessors, George IV and William IV. Equally, archival research by the historic royal palace's curators has suggested that Victoria's later recollection of her unhappy childhood was misremembered. There is plenty of evidence that her mother loved her deeply and spoiled Victoria. She was surrounded by her beloved governess and supportive tutors. She even enjoyed trips to the coast, the theatre, and the ballet, which she loved the most. She also went on several royal tours around the country between 1830 and 1835. An avid writer, she recorded these excursions and noted down her impressions of the country. She wrote of her shock after seeing the Black Country in the West Midlands, so named because of the smog caused by iron making and coal mining. On one of her earliest trips, she described the country as very desolate, with everywhere smoking, and burning coal heaps intermingled with rickety huts, carts, and little ragged children. To William IV's annoyance, Victoria was greeted warmly by crowds of people at every point of her journeys. William disliked the way that these tours seemed to present Victoria as his rival rather than his heir, and compared them to royal progresses. A medieval royal tour in which the king would be greeted at every town he stopped in with formal ceremonies and festivals. Victoria too disliked these tours, partly because of their exhausting nature, and partly because of William's disapproval, but her mother forced her to continue with them. In 1835, Conroy made his biggest attempt to solidify his control over the future queen. During another tour, Victoria contracted a severe fever while at Ramsgate, a seaside town in southeast England, and Conroy and her mother took advantage of her state to badger her into making Conroy her private secretary. But Victoria resisted, as she had during all of Conroy's previous attempts to get himself an official position on her staff. As her uncle, the king, finally approached the end of his life, Victoria was viewed as the nation's hope. She emerged from her isolation and from the strict rules of her mother and Conroy as a bright new prospect, a new start for the monarchy. On the 20th of June, 1837, Victoria was awoken early at 6 a.m. to receive some unexpected visitors at Kensington Palace who were bearing important news. She went downstairs and unusually saw these visitors alone, and while still wearing her dressing gown. Chief among her visitors was Lord Cunningham, the Lord Chamberlain, the most senior officer of the royal household, who told her that her uncle, the king, had died at 2:12 a.m. Victoria was now queen, and at age 18 she was old enough to rule. One of the first actions that Victoria took was having her bed removed from her mother's bedroom. This was not the only step she took to break free from the influence of her mother and Conroy that day. The day of her accession, Victoria dressed in mourning black to honour her uncle, and made her first public appearance as queen alone, stepping confidently out of her mother's shadow. Her first official appearance was a success. 97 councillors, cabinet ministers, and officials arrived in the Red Saloon at Kensington Palace for their first meeting with the new queen. The Duke of Wellington later described this gathering of the Accession Council and noted that, despite the new queen's petite size, Victoria was only 5'1". She had not only filled her chair, she filled the room. Flushed with the success of her first appearance, Victoria set about asserting her influence and crafting a new life for herself. She fled the confinement of the Kensington system and left Kensington Palace itself for Buckingham Palace, which became her main residence. She dismissed Conroy and kept her mother. Victoria was kept at arm's length by installing her in a distant apartment in Buckingham Palace, and later in a house in Belgrave Square. A governess, Baroness Lazen, was invited to live in Buckingham Palace as Victoria's companion. It was around this time that Victoria dropped her first name, Alexandrina, and went solely by Victoria. Despite her outward confidence, Victoria did admit to feeling nervous on her coronation day, held on the 28th of June, 1838. The coronation drew thousands of people out onto the streets to catch a glimpse of the young new queen. Victoria later wrote in her diary that the sight of the cheering and waving crowd from her carriage calmed her nerves. How proud I felt to be queen of such a nation! The coronation itself did not run smoothly. The bishop fumbled his lines and called the ceremony to an end too early. An elderly peer had a fall, and the coronation ring was placed onto the incorrect finger. But the elated public would not remember these mishaps, as they enjoyed fireworks and a fair at Hyde Park, as well as free access to the theatres across London. As with many important moments in Victoria's reign, care was taken to allow the public a glimpse of the monarch and a chance to celebrate the monarchy. Unlike her coronation, the first year of Victoria's reign passed without any serious missteps. Her youth and distance from her unpopular predecessors encouraged a rose-tinted view of her reign. Many people looked forward to a new and hopeful era under her rule. Her petite size, youth, inexperience, and gender resulted in people underestimating her. Her agenda had barred her from taking up the throne of Hanover, upon which her predecessors had sat, because ancient Salic law excluded women from Hanoverian succession. Instead, her father's unpopular younger brother, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, became King of Hanover, as well as Victoria's heir, until she had a child. But Victoria was determined to succeed as monarch of Britain, writing in her diary, "I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young, and perhaps in many, although not all things inexperienced, but I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." Her rosy first year was followed by a harder second. 1. Partly as a result of her over-dependence on her favourite ministers and advisers, particularly Prime Minister Lord Melbourne of the Whig Party and King Leopold of Belgium. Victoria's reliance on Melbourne and their close relationship caused rumours to spread that the new Queen was under the Prime Minister's influence, and, despite a large age gap of 40 years, that they were having a secret romantic relationship, a rumour that has never been proven. It seems more likely that the inexperienced Victoria relied on Melbourne for advice and looked up to him as a father figure, given that Melbourne was widowed and childless. Many, including aristocrat and diarist Charles Greville, noted that he was passionately fond of her, as he might be of his daughter if he had one. In the year 1839, 2 political scandals threatened to tarnish Victoria's reputation. The first was a court intrigue involving Lady Flora Hastings, a lady-in-waiting to Victoria's mother, who it was rumoured was expecting an illegitimate child with Conroy. An abdominal growth later proved in a post-mortem to be a large tumour on the liver fueled these rumours. Victoria, who harboured deep resentment against Conroy and her mother for her restricted childhood, believed the rumours and demanded evidence. Lady Flora initially refused to submit to an intimate medical examination, only acquiescing to an examination in February, which proved that she was a virgin. The Hastings family, Conroy, and the opposing Tories turned the press against the Queen, claiming that she had spread false rumours about Lady Flora, and Victoria was hissed at during public appearances. To make matters worse, another political scandal quickly succeeded the first: the bedchamber crisis of 1839. Lord Melbourne had resigned as Prime Minister after the Liberal Radicals and Tories voted against a bill to suspend the Constitution of Jamaica. The bill, passed by a narrow majority, removed political power from the plantation owners who had resisted the abolition of slavery. A Tory government was to be formed under Robert Peel, but Victoria's refusal to allow Peel to appoint her ladies of the bedchamber, as was the political custom, caused a political crisis. When Peel refused to govern under the restrictions Victoria had imposed, Melbourne returned to office, and many questioned Victoria's ability to rule as a constitutional monarch, a figure who should sit above and apart from the politics of Parliament. When support for Melbourne and the House of Commons finally dried up in 1841, the ladies of the bedchamber most associated with the Whigs were replaced as Peel became Prime Minister. During the 1841 general election, just as the dominance of her mother and Conroy had waned, Lord Melbourne's influence over Victoria was also to come to an end. Her next confidant and chief political advisor was to have the greatest impact on her life and reign: her husband, German Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria and Prince Albert had first met in May 1836. Albert, who was also Victoria's cousin, was invited to visit Kensington Palace by Victoria's mother, and under the encouragement of his uncle, King Leopold of Belgium. A union between them had been planned by their families almost from birth. Despite King William IV's disapproval, he had wanted to avoid another Coburg royal match and preferred Prince Alexander of the Netherlands as a suitor. Victoria and Albert had already become friends during Albert's visit in 1836, but it wasn't until 1839 that Victoria decided she was ready for marriage. On the 23rd of November 1839, Victoria summoned the Privy Council to Buckingham Palace to declare her intention to marry Albert. She had carefully financial prudence meant that she successfully cleared her father's debts and ran a relatively simple home for a royal, in sharp contrast to the excesses of her predecessors. Victoria recognized that public opinion rose when she openly devoted herself to her children, and letting Albert take over some of her royal duties proved to be a wise decision. Upon their marriage, Albert had been granted the formal title of HRH Prince Albert, but was popularly known as HRH Prince Consort, a title which Victoria formalised on the 29th of June 1857. The effective working partnership between Victoria and Albert was summed up by Charles Greville in 1845 when he wrote, "They are one person, and he likes and she dislikes business." Albert aimed to create a new powerful role as Prince Consort. Recognizing a rival influence over his wife, Albert persuaded Victoria to send her confidant, Baroness Lazen, back to Germany for a quiet retirement. After the death of Prime Minister Melbourne in 1842, Victoria became entirely dependent on Albert. Albert's wise guidance and connections proved invaluable to Victoria, but she still took ownership over decisions that were important to her. As the Great Famine tore through Ireland, killing over 1 million people and displacing another million, Victoria was denounced as the famine queen in Ireland. In January 1847, she donated $2,000 of her personal money to the British Relief Association, an amount worth several million in today's money, the greatest donation made by any individual. She supported the repeal of the Corn Laws, which were keeping the price of grain artificially high and fueling the devastating impact of the famine for the Irish people. She boldly ignored Protestant opposition to support the increase of an annual grant from the British government to St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, a dilapidated Catholic seminary in Ireland. Later, rumours of Victoria's cold indifference to the plight of the Irish, and the story that she had only donated £5 to the relief and had given the same amount to Battersea Dogs Home on the same day, were fabricated. Victoria's first visit to Ireland in 1849, when the famine was almost at an end, was a success, though it had no lasting impact on the growth of Irish nationalism. Victoria and Albert both took a keen interest in Europe, especially in improving foreign relations between Britain and France. Victoria became the first British monarch to visit a French monarch, since King Henry VII had visited King Francis I of France in 1520. Through Albert, Victoria was related to the House of Orléans via the Coburgs, and visited King Louis-Philippe I in Normandy twice, in 1843 and 1845. When Louis-Philippe returned the visit in 1844, he became the first French king to visit a British sovereign, and when he was deposed during the revolutions of 1848, he sought exile in England. Demonstrations in England by the Chartists and Irish nationalists failed to attract the widespread support that revolutionary movements were seeing on the European continent. Albert was also responsible for the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was designed as a public celebration of technological innovation and the growth of trade. Albert was very intelligent and highly interested in trade, industry, art, and science. The Great Exhibition featured over 100,000 exhibits from across the world and even displayed the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond from India. As Albert was socially conscious, perhaps more so than his wife, the Great Exhibition was fairly priced to allow anyone to visit. The top price season ticket of 3 guineas was equivalent to over £2,000 in today's money, but there were also cheap day tickets available at the reasonable price of 1 shilling. Over 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition. It gave many people their first taste of the wider world and was widely lauded as a huge success. Victoria herself was so enthralled by her husband's project that she visited the exhibition almost every day for 3 months. The Great Exhibition also had foreign admirers. Napoleon III of France invited Victoria and Albert to the Exposition Universelle in August 1855 after visiting the royal couple in London earlier that year. They were also guests of honour at an extravagant ball at the Palace of Versailles and visited the tomb of Napoleon I on their trip. Victoria and Albert also sought to bolster relations with Albert's German homeland. In 1858, Albert's favourite child, Vicky, their firstborn, was married at age 17 to Prince Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, the future Kaiser of Germany, on the 25th of January 1858 at the Royal Chapel of St James's Palace in London. Albert hoped that the liberal education he had given his daughter would help her steer Prussia, and later the German Empire, into a liberal constitutional monarchy based on the British model. But he hugely miscalculated, overestimating the strength of the very small middle class in Prussia and underestimating the popularity of conservatism. Vicky was not to have the happy life that her father had when he married into a foreign royal family. Vicky was criticised for her overly British views on monarchy and her English origins. She was ostracised by the royal house of the Hohenzollerns, the conservatives at the Berlin court, and her rising political opponent, Otto von Bismarck. As tensions deepened between her childhood nation and the nation of her marriage, Vicky became very unpopular and suffered through the fortuitous management of their 9 children. Victoria and Albert successfully made connections to foreign royal families across the European continent. Many of the thrones of Europe belonged to or were closely related to Victoria's 9 children and her 42 grandchildren. Of the 8 grandchildren which their eldest child Vicky gave them, Sophie went on to marry a Greek prince, becoming Queen of Greece. Alexandra of Denmark resulted in connections with Denmark, and when their own child married the King of Norway, several connections were formed with the German states, including through the marriage of their 3rd child, Princess Alice, to Grand Duke Louis IV of the German state of Hesse. Their daughter, Alex, went on to marry the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. Connections with Russia had already been formed when Victoria's 4th child, Prince Alfred, was married to Grand Duchess Marie, daughter of Tsar Alexander II. Their 5th child, Princess Helena, married Prince Frederick Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, further solidifying relations with the German states. However, their 6th child, Princess Louise, broke the mold by marrying a commoner, John Douglas Sutherland Campbell, who became the Duke of Argyll, a prominent MP and Governor-General of Canada. This unique marriage actually had the support of Victoria, British Prime Minister Disraeli, and the general public, as many feared yet another German marriage. Prince Arthur, child number 7 and a military enthusiast, had risen to the rank of Field Marshal and married Princess Louise. Marguerite of Prussia, their 8th child and youngest boy, Prince Leopold, married Princess Helena Frederica of Waldeck and Piemont, another German state, although he died 2 years after this happy union was formed due to haemophilia, a genetic condition which spread through Victoria's network of descendants across Europe. This condition particularly harmed the Russian royal family when the sole heir to the throne, Alexei, the son of Victoria's granddaughter Alex and Tsar Nicholas, was found to harbour the often deadly disease. As Victoria's husband Albert had died when their 9th and last child, Princess Beatrice, was 4 years old, Victoria rejected any potential suitors and kept her close as a companion. At the age of 27, Beatrice finally met her love match, Prince Henry of Battenberg, at a family wedding. Although Victoria remained opposed to the match for 8 months, the couple eventually wore her down, and they married with her blessing under the condition that they live in Britain. Their daughter Victoria would marry into the Spanish royal family, introducing the haemophilic gene into another European dynasty. On the whole, Victoria and Albert had succeeded in their aim of building connections across Europe with the marriages of their 9 children and 42 grandchildren, but their goal of Europe-wide peace failed enormously as the First World War broke out. Even with 3 cousins on the rival thrones of Britain, Russia, and Germany, Victoria's life and her happy family were blown apart in 1861 when her mother died. Although they had not had a perfect relationship, Victoria felt huge grief when she discovered in her mother's papers that she had, in fact, deeply loved her daughter. Worse tragedy followed when the person she depended on most for support and strength, her husband Albert, also died. Albert fell ill of typhoid fever and died on the 14th of December 1861 at the young age of 42. Victoria was heartbroken and never moved beyond her grief. She wrote to her uncle Leopold that, "My life as a happy one is ended. The world is gone for me." Her royal duties and the carefully honed image of the royal domestic family came under threat during a Privy Council meeting 3 weeks after Albert's death. Victoria was so full of grief that she couldn't speak. Consumed by deep grief, Victoria wore mourning black and minimal jewelry for the rest of her life and withdrew from public gaze, which was disastrous for her public image. Her depression caused her to put on weight, which further discouraged her from making public appearances. She became very lonely and overcompensated by dominating her children's time and obsessively keeping the memory of their father alive. Victoria's seclusion led people to assume that she was incapable of doing her job. She lost her confidence and avoided public appearances other than her official government duties, retreating behind the walls of her favourite royal residences, Balmoral in Scotland, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and Windsor Castle. The public began to lose respect for the Queen, and some even began to call for the abolition of the monarchy. Doctors who came to see Victoria feared that she was mentally ill. She remained in self-imposed seclusion until the early 1880s, when her family, in particular her uncle Leopold, confidants and Prime Minister Disraeli, finally convinced her to appear more in public. Under their encouragement, she agreed to visit the gardens of the Royal Horticultural Society at Kensington and to take a drive through London in an open carriage. But it was really two men, John Brown and Abdul Karim, who succeeded in pulling Victoria out of her grief enough to fully repair her image and become involved in the political sphere once more. John Brown, a plain-speaking Highlander and Victoria's manservant, became one of her favourites. In 1861, Victoria described his constant presence as a real comfort, but not everyone approved of his influence over the Queen. The press suggested the two were secretly married, and Brown became very unpopular within the royal household, a fact which did not dissuade Victoria in the slightest. Brown helped Victoria deal with her deep grief and treated her as a woman rather than a queen. In 1866, Victoria stepped back into the political sphere, attending the state opening of Parliament for the first time since Albert's death, and openly supporting the Reform Act of 1867, which extended voting rights to many urban working men. The second of Victoria's confidants was even more unpopular with the court than John Brown. Abdul Karim was Victoria's personal servant and munshi, or teacher, from India. From 1887 to the end of her life, Karim perhaps attracted more prejudice and jealousy than Brown due to ideas of racial superiority which were widespread at the time, and because he was from a low social background. But as with Brown, Victoria did not listen to the advice and jealous mutterings of others. Karim taught Victoria the Urdu language, which she became fluent in, and about Indian culture, which fascinated her. Victoria's notes from her lessons still survive, along with many of her other writings. The Queen became increasingly interested in the British Empire in the latter part of her reign, and devoted much time and energy to promoting the expansion and glorification of the empire. By the end of Victoria's reign, the British Empire covered more than a fifth of the world's landmass and included nearly 1 in 4 people, including the entire Indian subcontinent, as well as large parts of Africa and several Caribbean islands. Between 1815 and 1914, approximately 400 million people and 10 million square miles were added to the empire, the majority of which occurred during Victoria's long reign. The wars of Victoria's era were often fought on distant shores, an exception being the Crimean War, which was fought against Russia from 1854 to 1856. It was during this war that the first Victoria Cross was awarded. It was the first official honour granted to ordinary servicemen for bravery. The British Army and Royal Navy were involved in conflicts in Afghanistan, China, India, Ghana against the Ashanti people, in Eastern and Southern Africa against the Zulus, Egypt, and in South Africa against the Boers. Victoria was not naive about the cost of empire. She was very much in favour of expansionism and the empire, and deeply approved of Prime Minister Disraeli's expansionist foreign policy. If we are to maintain our position as a first-rate power, we must be prepared for attacks and wars somewhere or other. She saw the expansion of the British Empire as necessary for civilization and for protecting native people from aggressive rulers. On the 1st of May 1876, Victoria was crowned Empress of India, a title bestowed on her by parliamentary vote, although she had been both interested and involved in the ruling of India long before then. In the 1840s, she had registered her disgust at the behaviour of the East India Company, a semi-private corporation that ran the British territories in India and profited hugely from trade in the region. In 1856, she wrote, "I always feel sorry for those poor deposed Indian princes." Victoria had actually met one of the men deposed by the British, Duleep Singh, the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, who had been deposed by the British in 1848, and was invited to meet Victoria and Albert in 1854 after he had converted to Christianity. Despite an attempt to return to Lahore and take back the throne, in later life he was reconciled with Victoria in 1890 when she gave him a full pardon. Victoria would become the godmother to Singh's daughter, Princess Sophia Alexandrovna Duleep Singh, who became a prominent English suffragette and campaigned for women's rights outside Hampton Court Palace. where Victoria had allowed her family to live. Despite her interest in India, her mastery of the Urdu language, and her friendship with Abdul Karim, Victoria never visited India. As well as her investiture as Empress of India, Victoria's popularity was restored by the extravagant celebrations of her Golden Jubilee in 1887, marking 50 years of her rule, and the Diamond Jubilee in 1897, celebrating 60 years. Her appearances in public caused great excitement, and her open smile as she processed through London on an open carriage ride on the day of her Golden Jubilee was one of the very few moments when Victoria's smile was captured on camera. But Victoria did not forget her grief in private, writing on the day of her Golden Jubilee, "The day has come, and I am alone." By 1897, Victoria's popularity and her confidence were fully restored. She became seen as the nation's grandmother and received thousands of congratulatory messages for her Diamond Jubilee from across the world. She sent a telegraph message of thanks to her subjects. "From my heart, I thank my beloved people. May God bless them." The huge outpouring of a national pride led to the era being known as Victorian Britain. The lack of major wars to fund during her reign, especially in comparison with the decades following her reign, and the huge new wealth generated by industry and trade resulted in a larger and more affluent middle and upper class, which could afford to spend more on leisure. Town parks began to open, the first in Preston, Lancashire, and cricket, football, rugby, and athletic clubs were established. Music halls, theatres, readings, and comic operas became increasingly popular, and museums opened, including the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1852. For those not living in poverty, the Victorian age was truly a golden period. By 1901, at the age of 81, Victoria was becoming frail, had lost a lot of weight, and had to use a wheelchair to move around. She moved to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight for peace and to avoid the spotlight. The few people who saw her at this time said she seemed to have shrunk to half the person she had been. She suffered from osteoarthritis, a condition that made her joints painfully stiff, and her surviving dresses from this period were altered to accommodate a dowager's hump, a hump on her upper back caused by spinal collapse. The last year of Victoria's life had been hard. She had lived to see the death of her second son, Alfred, in July 1900, who had died after the suicide of his own son, the breakdown of his marriage, and excessive drinking. Her favourite grandson, Christian Victor, child of her daughter Beatrice, died in October 1900 of malaria, along with his father. The sorrow perhaps shortened Victoria's life, as her companions noted that not only her stature, but also her spirit seemed to be shrinking, and she lost her appetite. Despite being nearly blind, Victoria continued to write in her diary until her last entry on the 13th of January 1901, when her strength began to leave her. As her death loomed, joining her son and successor Edward VII, Victoria died on the 22nd of January in 1901 at the age of 81 in her grandson's arms on the Isle of Wight. She had ruled for almost 64 years, the longest reign of any British monarch up to that point. In keeping with the Queen's wishes, her body was dressed in a white dress and her wedding veil and brought back to London. Her funeral procession passed through streets full of mourners on its way to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where her funeral was held. Her eldest son, King Edward VII, walked behind her coffin, accompanied by her third son, Prince Arthur, and grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Her funeral was simple and respectful, as she had requested. Victoria was then laid to rest with her husband, Albert, at the Royal Mausoleum near Frogmore House in the grounds of Windsor Castle. She had asked for certain items to be buried with her, including some jewellery, plaster casts of her children's hands, and Albert's dressing gown. She had also secretly asked her trusted royal doctor to add a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair to her left hand. Above the mausoleum door were inscribed Victoria's words, "Farewell, best beloved, here at last I shall rest with thee. With thee in Christ, I shall rise again." Victoria was the last British monarch of the House of Hanover, and was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, on the 22nd of January in 1901. Victoria never believed that she, as a woman, was the best person to be monarch. She believed, like many of her contemporaries, that men made the best leaders. But by the time of her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, no one, not even Victoria herself, could doubt that a woman was capable of being the monarch. Despite several years of unpopularity when she became a reclusive widow, Victoria was immensely popular, especially in the 1880s and 1890s. She appeared to many to be a benevolent matriarchal figure above politics. Only after her death and the release of her diaries and letters did the extent of her deep political influence become clear. Although constrained by the constitutional monarchy she represented, Victoria took advantage of her rights, that is, the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. As Sir Walter Bagehot stated, more than once she altered the direction of policies and politicians by wielding her influence. Victoria, despite her lack of confidence, had been a skilled politician who successfully presented herself as a devoted wife and mother, which home-loving Victorians idolized and identified with strict standards of personal morality. Victoria brought stability to a monarchy that had been rocked by a series of unreliable and often unpopular kings. She had made the monarchy more accessible, for example, by opening up her birthplace, Kensington Palace, to the public in 1899, by setting the public-oriented tone of her own and future royal weddings, and through her public appearances, such as at the Great Exhibition. Victoria's reign took Britain through a tumultuous period of industrial, economic, technological, and social change. She had overseen huge expansion abroad and stability and growth at home, and her reign was remembered by the Victorians and their descendants as a golden age of British greatness. Yet in some ways, her legacy and the legacy of her era have become more contentious over time as historians evaluate the cost of industrial progress and expansion abroad. The experiences of non-British subjects of the Empire and the poor in Britain are now being included in the narrative of the Victorian age. Victoria's investiture as Empress of India and her role as leader of the empire complicate her legacy. Victoria and Albert's intention to promote peace in Europe by establishing a network of alliances through royal marriages represented another failure. Although Victoria was fondly known as the grandmother of Europe and had successfully married off her 9 children and 42 grandchildren into several royal European houses, war was not avoided. By the turn of the 20th century, Victoria's grandchildren were on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Denmark, Greece, Norway, Romania, and Spain. But her vision of a peaceful Europe was not to come to pass, as her own grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, led Germany into war against Britain in 1914. Amongst her notable descendants, the 3 cousins, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Tsar Nicholas II, and King Edward VII, have often been blamed by historians for the outbreak of the First World War. But Victoria and Albert's legacy lives on, as their living descendants still sit on several European thrones. From her links to present-day monarchs, to the history of the Victorian age that British children are taught at school, Victoria endures. The image of her as a stately old lady clad in her black mourning attire has defined her to this day. But a more complex image of Victoria and her era is coming to light. What do you think of Queen Victoria? Was she a passive woman dominated by powerful male advisors and far removed from the suffering of her people? Or was she a complex and intelligent ruler who did what she could within the limitations of a constitutional monarchy? And now, our peaceful journey through the Hanoverian line draws to a close. From George IV's glittering court, to William IV's reforms, and finally to Queen Victoria, who watched Britain rise to global power, we've gently wandered through time together. If you found comfort in tonight's tale, please comment your favorite royal moment, and subscribe to keep history whispering you to sleep. Sleep well, dear listener. May your night be quiet, your dreams kind, and your soul wrapped in peace. Until next time, good night from Sleepy Crown.